Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are ready to get started on our first of 4 panels. The theme of this panel is Youth Migration and Politics in the Global South. And to moderate is my colleague here at the Hamilton Lugar School, Dr. Amadou Beatty Sow, who's a senior lecturer in our African Studies program. He teaches Bamana. He has a master's degree from the École Normale Supérieure in his home country of Mali in Bamako. And he has an MA in International Studies and PhD in Education from Ohio University, not far away. He's also an expert in the theme of the panel, having written a book entitled Political Leadership in the Hand of Teachers, the type of leadership teacher politicians display on the political scene in Mali. And so Beatty will moderate the panel. He'll invite our panelists to offer some opening remarks and then engage them in some conversation. And we hit about the 45-minute mark. We will shift to audience Q&A, which we can handle. Beatty can call on questions. And again, please share your name and your affiliation when you have the questions. I'll signal to Beatty when we're getting close to that 30-minute mark so that we can engage you in the conversation. So thank you, Beatty, for moderating, and look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, everybody. This is wonderful. I'm so pleased to be here. Very honored, too. I know it's my school, and I'm so happy to welcome you all here. Okay, one thing is that about my dean, introduced me, but my diploma is kind of bizarre. I got my diploma in cultural studies, but cultural study was housed by education. So that's why I had a problem. But I did all my work on political science. And it was so bizarre because I got my money from cultural studies. And the cultural studies say, okay, you want to do a PhD in political science, but we have money here for you. So why don't you want to come here? So we have free money for you. I said, okay, I want to do that, but I want to do in the political science. It's that's fine, you can go anywhere. But cultural studies is multidisciplinary, but it was house and education. So education has its name on my diploma, but I'm not an education person. Okay, that's a little clarification. Thank you, guys. Okay, professor was a wonderful presenter, and when he talked about migration is not new. It's not new. Yeah, because let's imagine, without migration, what would be America today, Canada, South America, even a huge part of Europe, Africa. So migration is something new. So why is it it's a serious issue today? Then we have to talk a lot about migration, but we have to understand also the root cause causes, let's say that way, of migration in the world. But one of the problems of migration, it's like we can only point out to African being the number one that wanted or unwanted in the world. But we have also to look at the positive and the negative impact of migration in the world. But that's going to be one of the job of our presenter. So we have to understand also, I will always step in because that's one thing, topic that I did a lot of research about it, and I'm teaching a class about it too. So that's a domain that I'm familiar with. Okay, I talk too much as any teacher here, so that's our job, so we talk too much. But we talk not for the sake of talking, we talk to help the world to get better. Okay. Saying this, we have 3 presenters. We have Dr. Sarafin, who is a professor here, and we have Eric Chure, who is a professor also at IU, but IU Indianapolis. And we have Dr. Mampili, who is in New York, right? Okay, New York. This is the second time we invited Dr. Mampili to be here with us. I'm here to facilitate, but I'm here also to contribute whenever it's necessary. Okay, after that, I need to give the floor to Dr. Sarafin.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to be here as part of the panel. And thank you for the introduction. And thank you to the organizers of this symposium, especially to the Dean of HLS and all the team. To start talking about migration or immigration in Latin America or from Latin America, I would like to contextualize. Sometimes we talk about migration in isolation. I think I would like to mention that Latin America is a very multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multilingual country. And it's also the geographic location of Latin America is it's different, it's diverse. We have the jungle, the Amazon region. We have the mountains, I belong to the mountains. And we have the coastal regions, and the Caribbeans, of course. It's a large territory where there are many languages, cultures, and many ways of doing things there. When we refer to about youth migration, I would like to focus on the factors of migration. Why young people, why they migrate to different parts of the world, from Latin America to the world. But they don't jump directly from their respective communities to the world or to an international level. The first stage of migration would be first from local, sometimes regional, national, transnational, and global. That's the tendency of, the trajectory of the migration. It doesn't happen just from the respective community and come all of a sudden to the United States. Especially, we're talking about population, I would say, not urban population, rural population. In this case, we're talking about many indigenous communities who live across Latin America. And for example, I'm gonna mention just one country, Bolivia, where the 76 or 78% are indigenous. So Brazil is another country with a lot of indigenous population. And recently, there are more and more indigenous people, immigrants who don't speak even Spanish or Portuguese. They speak their language. They're dealing all kinds of situations. And the factors of, now I'm gonna refer to the factors why young people immigrate to different parts of the world internally and transnationally. The first thing would be, the first factor would be the economic factor. And the it could be, if we join that, if we mix the socioeconomic, sociopolitical factor, the educational factor as well, it's very important. And young people are always looking for new opportunities to change their lives. Because what happened across Latin America, it's the government, the centralized government. The Ministry of Education depends, for example, it's for everybody, from the top down. So the rest, I think that the same happened in other countries around the world as well. So it's not bottom up, always top down. And they don't provide opportunities locally, enough opportunities for education, for social mobility. So young people are mobile, are the engine of of progress. They're always looking for new opportunities, new ways of getting, take advantage of the resources that I would say big metropolitan centers offer, especially at the transnational level, like the United States. That's why we have here a lot of immigrants coming from different parts of the world. Those are the factors sometimes, and there are intermarriage as well, another factor to come. They get married to people from, with someone that belongs to a different country, and they have to move. And poverty. Another factor would be natural disasters, conflicts, persecutions, all kind of sometimes local discrimination. Especially indigenous people, when indigenous people move to the big city, the capital, the metropolitan areas, they suffer all kinds of discrimination in their respective countries. And then they try to look for more opportunities. For example, they want to find a job, a decent job, to keep moving forward. I think that's a very fundamental reason why youth always are on the move, and looking for opportunities. I like when it was mentioned before that we should take immigrants as not as a problem, but as a resource here. Because, for example, the United States, where there are millions of immigrants from Latin America, all kinds of immigrants. And I say we because I'm from Latin America, we are the backbone of this country. Backbone. We are pillars that support the maintenance and the progress of this country, whether you recognize it or not, but that's a true reality. We cannot escape from that. So this is a straightforward opinion I'm sharing with you. Yes. And I think I'm gonna stop here and then, yes.
All right, can you hear me? All right, thank you. And yeah, thank you for, thanks, Sarah, for that. You know, as we have been hearing, I mean, immigration is not a new thing. However, I mean, there are, dynamics. I mean, I think it's a process, and the way we are looking at it, it's something that I think have been set in motion. It has a geohistorical context in factors that I think shape the contemporary dynamics, and I think it's important. I think one of the things that we see today, what we've been talking a lot, and like when our keynote speaker was talking, see most of the slides and some of the things that look like so bleak, they are the evolving consequences of those forces, and of course the contemporary dynamics are part, and that's where I think leadership becomes important in that. So when you think of youth in the idea about youth as a capacity, community asset, youth are a great asset to every community. And so when they begin to move, on one end, they are moving away with the capital, the resources, and all of the agency and the possibilities that can even shape the local context, right? And so then why would you think about them as a problem? It's actually a form of, depopulation, but it's also resource, what do you call it, misappropriation. But the context that, initiate those kinds of decisions Like when you think of, indigenous people, most people in indigenous context, like somebody like me, I grew up in a very, rural area, and how I ended up, I think, different trends of migration. I was just talking with Zachariah how, I moved from small, that area through schooling and all that into the capital, into the urban center, and then ending up here. It's education, right? But one of the things that's interesting is the way the kinds of the education that I received that make me even recognize anything in my context to be useful, right? And so it's all the time I was thinking, well, development, life, progress is always outside there. But when you think about some of the, even land is, when we are thinking of, asset, resources, land is one of the greatest key indicators. So why do people have to leave land and go to places where they are not even welcome, where they can't even get land, where all of these things are done? And so that's one area. I think part of it is we are educated in a way that do not even help us to know who we are and what we have and how to turn what we have into usable product for ourselves and for our community. And that kind of education is colonial educational project. I mean, it's too deep, and it's grounded in the, white supremacist logic. I think the other part of it also is the fact that, I mean, I think in most African countries, you have nearly all of the resources that powered life in most of these Western countries, you trace them to Africa. And we call African countries that they are low resource, low income countries, disadvantaged countries. But ever since, we discovered those continents, Europeans saw the continent, they have never left. Our models for working is a capitalist. How will a capitalist be continuously in a place that doesn't have any resource, where they won't be able to get anything? But we are not, told about some of these pieces. And one of the other piece of that is, I think, how some of these factors have also shaped what leadership is, and the role that leadership, how leadership create the context that influence the decision for young people to move or to stay, right? And that's also one of the piece. I mean, when you look at most of the leaders in the African countries, a lot of them have degrees and education outside of Africa, Europe, North America, right? So what have we been giving them? How have we trained them to go back and do the kinds of the leadership that really, make them connect to who they are, their culture, their context, and all of the things that actually will help them. Now, that will not stop migration. There's times where people can decide, I am going here maybe on a vacation, on this, on that. Those are important. We all do that, right? But when it becomes an issue where people are running away from resources into places where they sometimes get into even harm, that's a problem, right? And then the other thing, part of, as I was talking about these geohistorical factors, I mean, you can't talk about this without talking about slavery, particularly the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, I think it created a context. This was a global nature, right? The trade from Europe, Africa, and then the product that were made from Europe, North America, coming back looking for market into Africa, but not really creating the context there that will turn the raw materials there into usable product that will keep the people in there, right? And so then you have that infrastructure and the resources that are supposed to make some of those things, facilitate even within country, within community movement and mobility and relationship. That didn't happen. And as we heard in the speaker, some of the areas where you were talking about lack of access and the logistical issues, the bureaucratic processes. These are all part of the things that what we've seen, particularly in African countries, most of our context, roads, and means of transportation. If you go there to most African societies, you see the road that was constructed during the colonial era. They lead to where resources are, right? Into the harbors and in places. And so then after what we call today, we describe most African states as independent. But that's not true, right? That we have some kinds of geopolitical retreat. That is true. But that's the first phase of the process leading to real independence and sovereignty. That had never happened. So because of that, you have a process where we inherited the structures that, again, have not, because of the trauma connected to these issues, they have not been able to really make any significant impact. And so the kinds of the restrictions and those logistical issues that are impediment are grounded in some of these issues. And so now it make most youth think that nothing is there, there's so much despair, there's so much frustration, and then the other side of it is we see a lot, I think, in the West and in most European countries, most of the Western nations, we are very good at faking. I mean, let's say the truth. We project a lot of internal beauty and all kinds of things, but we hide so much of the internal fractures that are going on here. And that attract most of these folks, again, which is also the way we think about how life is and what life ought to be, and so it attracts most of them to feel like to make life, they have to be out of the spaces where they have good food, nice, organic food and all of the things, and leave them and to come and eat junks, right? Where they'll be sick. They get all kinds of things without even access to healthcare. And yet we don't tell the truth about what these kinds of things are. So the pull factor here, I think, part of the deceptive mechanism, but it's also designed such a way so that they can come for exploitation, which is working. And then, of course, you have the other part, I think, from the work that I do around, the identity crisis. When I think about collective memories and collective cultural trauma, I think because of the kinds of the histories that, in most Africans, people are, conditioned by, we talk a lot, corruption is one of the factors, but corruption also is rooted in the same history. Because most leaders will amass resources and hoard it and move them away from creating opportunity for youth. But those corruption has the same, origin and the history. Like most of the African societies during the colonial administration, they were collecting taxes, right, at the expense of their people into the colonial masters, and they were getting commission. Some were getting about 20%, 10%. And so today, our political leaders are still walking in the same shoes. A lot of them get into power. They want to come and buy houses in the West. They have savings account in the West. We don't do anything about those things, right? And so the monies and the thing that they would have used to build the infrastructure that would keep the youth there are saving them. They're saving them here. They are paying mortgages for them and then building their own aristocratic system to come and still continue on those kinds of things. And so then a lot of them, with that opportunity, think, okay, then they need to move out and look for the opportunity. And so before I stop, I think the other time I was looking at, there's the data, there's this, and in Ghana specific, we have this Child Inc. International. They did a research interviewing about 11,288, youth from 12 to 17 years old. And some of the things that they raised were like about 90% of them were very proud to be, Ghanaians. But in the course of it, about 50% want to leave the country by 2040, right? And when they cited the cause of the reasons, they cited unemployment. And that across the African country. I mean, Afrobarometer data would tell you most of them, even after education, don't have jobs. And it comes to talk about, the nature of the education. But then they also talk about high poverty, right? They talk about corruption and the poor education system and streetism. These are all factors that are linked to these same historical pathing that are shaping leadership processes. And so we can't talk about this outside of the leadership issue, but we can also talk about the leadership issues without thinking about those historical forces that were initiated and that are evolving today in creating this, making it look like there's no future for the youth. So I will end here and then let you talk later, and then we'll have more conversations.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me back in Bloomington. It's always wonderful to be here. And I think a lot of these topics are very relevant to what we discussed last time when I was speaking more about youth movements and youth protests within African countries. So rather than rehash, I think, some of the topics that have already been raised here, I think we had a fantastic keynote lecture that really outlined some of the push and pull factors, as our panelists have made clear here, that drive the migration question. I don't want to simply rehash those topics. I want to pull back a little bit. I think the subject of migration is something that evokes a tremendous amount of passion. As we see, we have an election coming up in just a few days now, and the subject of migration has been central to this forthcoming election, as it has been to pretty much every election that I can remember as a late 40s individual. And so it suggests something to me that there is a kind of schizophrenia around this subject of migration, that maybe it's useful for me to offer a few provocations around why it is that migration remains this kind of evergreen subject that continues to provoke so much angst. And I have, I think, 5 minutes, so I'll try to be quick, right? And specifically, I just want to tie migration, and I offer these again in the spirit of discussion, to what I consider to be the kind of more meta issues that are underlying a lot of our anxieties about the question of migration and question of immigrants in particular. Specifically, the issue of capitalism, right? The issue of nationalism, and the issue of gender. And I think all three of these things, and I'm just speaking off the cuff here, are manifesting in a lot of the ways in which these issues are discussed ahead of the forthcoming election. So let me just start with the issue of nationalism. I think this came up in the keynote lecture, in the Q&A. It is hard to remember that the world of nation states is a very recent formation, right? I am 47 years old, I think, yeah. And both of my parents were not born in a nation state, right? They were born in India in the 1940s, and they were subjects of the British Empire. They were not citizens of the Indian nation, right? My mother is 78 years old. She's still fairly active. And I have to remind her that she wasn't actually born an Indian citizen, right? That she was born a British imperial subject because she was born 1 year before India became independent, right? Their experience is not unique. For the vast majority of the world, if you go back to your parents' generation or to your grandparents' generation, they were born as imperial subjects, right? They were not born into nation states. This process of dividing up global territory into these defined nation states is a very recent one, right? For the vast majority of the world's territory and populations, it's something that's only been going on for the past 75 to 80 years, starting in the 1940s with the decolonization of South Asia, continuing in the 1960s in Africa and the Caribbean, so really very, very, very recent. And it has been an extraordinarily violent process, right? Because it is my fundamental belief, and I think I have a lot of evidence for this, that humans are fundamentally a migratory species. So the process of transforming us into these nationally defined entities has required a tremendous degree of violence. And it's violence that is ongoing today and is especially visible in parts of Africa, right? Across Africa, we see a tremendous push by countries in the global north, by international institutions, by our own government, the United States, to build borders where they have never existed before, to prevent peoples who moved freely across these borders for millennia from moving across these borders anymore. Again, this has required a tremendous amount of resources to prevent people from their natural patterns of movement, of trade, of cultural dispersal. The war on terror has allowed the United States government in particular to take a huge interest in the Sahara, where we are trying to enforce arbitrary lines across desert sand by building these massive military enterprises. It has required a tremendous amount of violence. It has been hugely destructive. And to return to our topic of discussion here, it has produced a tremendous amount of migration as people have been pushed off of these lands that they have lived in for centuries. Right? We're not only talking about settled communities, but also populations that were historically nomadic. It's easy to forget that much of the human population is nomadic, or has been nomadic, until we have insisted on drawing these borders that require them to settle down, right? Without any evidence that that is an improved quality of life from what they were engaged in before. We can talk about populations like the Tuareg in places like Mali, which has, again, caused a tremendous amount of violence in that part of the world, violence that is ongoing, violence that is at the core of a lot of the dislocation that is occurring in that part of the world. Okay, so the first point, right, nationalism. And how much of the world is driven by this force of nationalism, despite the fact that it is a very, very recent phenomenon, okay? Second point, capitalism. I think when we think about capitalism, until fairly recently, there was a very strong emphasis in the West, in the United States in particular, that capitalism requires freedom, right? That there's an innate relationship between capitalism and freedom. We hear a lot about the free market, right? The idea that freedom is inevitably tied to capitalism. This was the entire subtext of the Cold War, this idea that free societies have free markets. But it's useful to disaggregate what we mean by this relationship between capitalism and freedom, which is a very famous title of a book by a libertarian hero, and ask, what are the components of that? Right? And we can think of capitalism as requiring three types of inputs. Right? Obviously, capital, it's right there in the name, which is money. We insist that capital be free so that you can move your capital anywhere in the globe in an instant. You can buy assets all around the world. We know that corporations have investments, so we call them an American company, but all of their inputs are coming from African countries, all of their products are manufactured in Asian countries, and they're all sold back here in the West or in Europe. And that is essential to how global capitalism functions. We need this free movement of money, right? We need also, obviously, the free movement of goods, right? The products that are being produced, ideally, again, until fairly recently with the rise of Trumpism in the United States, we expected that goods should move freely, that they should be able to move across borders without any sort of tariffs and subsidies. And that has allowed, especially in the West, in the global North, a tremendous improvement in our quality of lives, right? We can buy supercomputers for about $900, or much less, for about $250, you can buy an Android smartphone that has been produced with commodities taken out of the ground in Africa, often, again, producing tremendous amounts of migration, right? Because this destruction of the environment is happening on a world historic scale, and it is transforming the livelihoods of people across places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I've done a lot of research, Sudan, another country that came up a lot in the keynote speech, that is a major source of many of the resources that are required to produce these goods, right? And we take it for granted, right? Most Americans will say, under Trumpism, that they would prefer increased tariffs on many of these goods. But I think that's only as durable until they start to see the cost of what it actually entails to produce these goods domestically, what it would look like to actually impose tariffs on China at the rates that are being thrown around would entail $9,000 iPhones. Right? And I'm curious, at least, to see how that plays out in the American economy, in the American psyche. Right? So at least until recently, there has been a general consensus within pro-capitalist advocates that goods should move freely, that we should work to create a world that has no tariffs, that allows the free movement of goods. This has been really good for American businesses in particular, right? Now when we talk about American products, as I was saying, there's no sense of where all the components even came from in the first place. There's an overwhelming likelihood that if you buy an American car, that it has not been produced remotely in the United States, right? And this has been the structure of modern American capitalism, again, until fairly recently, right? Okay, last thing I want to say here is the third one, which is the gender question. Of course, gender has been, I think, driving recent American elections, at least since 2020, certainly in 2022. We saw that the Democratic Party benefited tremendously from issues of women's reproductive justice, right? In places where they did not expect to win, without the question of reproductive justice on the ballot, there would have been a red wave, as was predicted by political scientists, of which I am one, reluctantly. And the only thing that saved the Democratic Party was reproductive justice issues. We know that it is likely to again be the central issue in the upcoming election on Tuesday, regardless of where you stand on it, right? We know it's a hugely important force. And what does this have to do with the question of migration and Africa, right? Well, let me just start by saying that the vast majority of the world is no longer growing. I mean this in terms of demographically, right? In the social sciences, we use the concept of the replacement rate. That is the number of children each woman needs to have for a society to have a stable population. In the West, in advanced capitalist countries, it's 2.1, meaning that each woman is expected to have 2.1 children. This has basically collapsed in most of the advanced capitalist world. In places like South Korea, it is under 1. So the average South Korean woman is not even having 1 child, right? Across Western Europe, it is probably around 1.2, 1.3. Again, it has collapsed. Japan, much the same story. In the United States, it is also under 2. Right? Slightly better than Western Europe. Parts of like Portugal and stuff are like 0.9, like crazy, crazy low numbers. Greece has a very low number. The US is closer to like 1.7, 1.8, but still under that replacement rate figure. What that means is if you were to stop migration tomorrow, the American population would collapse, right? Within a generation. It would literally collapse. First, it would age rapidly, like Japan is currently, right? The oldest population in the world is Japan. That has a whole bunch of trickle-down effects for the entire social welfare system in that country. There are not enough young people paying into the social welfare systems. Japan remains reluctant to allow immigration, and so their population is rapidly shrinking. Russia is much the same situation. China has now crossed that point as well. They are desperately trying to encourage women to have children, right? India, which for a long time was a country that produced a surplus of people, has now moved in the opposite direction. So it recently peaked at 1.4 billion people, but it's expected to start to decrease, right? And we know that the vast majority of the world is experiencing the same exact phenomenon, except for 2 particular regions. One is West Asia, right? And the other, of course, is Africa. Those are the only 2 parts of the world that are actually producing more children at a sufficient level, right, to actually grow their societies. The rest of the countries that are growing, like the United States, are only growing because of immigration, right? Because of immigration. And those immigrants are not randomly distributed. They're coming from certain parts of the world. They're coming from the global south. They're coming from Latin America. They're coming from parts of West Asia. And they're coming from Africa, right? Especially Africa, which remains the youngest continent. And as I mentioned, the only part of the world where women are producing children above the replacement rate, right? So regardless of what issue, and this is the last thing I'll say, what issue we want to talk about in the United States, right? The question of migration and Africa's relationship to it is central. And it's very difficult to talk about these issues, I understand. But I think it is important for us, especially as social scientists, to try and make these connections apparent, because otherwise we get kind of restricted in how we talk about the immigration question. And I think we fall victim to reducing immigrants simply to their economic values, right? To this idea that the only argument we can offer for why we want immigration is the role that they play in labor markets, right? And I think as this panel has been making clear, and as our keynote speaker made clear, that is a very reductionist and I think problematic way for us to think about the question of immigration when it is so central to almost every aspect of our social, political, and economic lives. Thank you.
Great. That was great. I think we have 30 more minutes. Okay, I know we. Yes, I'm sorry, it was not on. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So, I mean, we've been talking about different things. So, like, one thing that I think that we need to, elaborate on a little bit is the leadership vis-a-vis the migration in Africa. And know also that Africa been oppressed by different powers, and the different power might not have the same impact in this Africa the same way. So, and then we might find like, French oppressed Africa, and British oppressed Africa, Portuguese oppressed Africa. I mean, migration might, be different from those places. Okay, what the role played by those leaders there in those areas, the leadership playing in those, different regions, okay, oppressed by different power in Africa. So I want to ask to be able to explain a little bit that to people. That's how the migration trends, okay, is in those different places in Africa. But we can talk about Latin America too, because of Portugal were there, and Spain were there, so we can present that picture. Even the French are there too, yeah.
Yes, regarding Latin America,
Yeah.
Of course, leaders play an important role because if the leaders are not providing opportunities to the youth population, different kind of opportunity, a wide range of opportunities, and then these young people will seek, will be looking for other opportunities to go to different countries. And leaders have to provide education, provide even health service, provide even technology access. They have to protect young population so they can continue moving forward. Otherwise, they will. Latin America will be losing a lot of young people, and once they leave the country, they will stay in the country when they move to those countries, because they will get enough education there. For example, when immigrants come to the United States from different countries, they get their masters and then, undergrad, masters, PhDs, and they end up staying. So that's a risk they have to take the countries. Instead of providing those opportunities, young people move because, as I said, they are not happy with whatever limited resources the government provides, the leaders provide them. So there is a lack of attention, lack of opportunity for those young generations. Another thing I want to link to this is the notion, I want to be very critical with this one. The notion of global South and global North. Why we are trying to create those divisions without any, the division is economically based, period. It's not based on geographic locations, nothing. It's just the economy. All the global south, we are the poor, we are the developed, we are we are countries that we need help. We don't have enough economical resources. So that division, to me, it's very, creating dichotomies like whites and non-whites, rich and poor, those dichotomies are dangerous for society, because that creates division. On top of that, the political divisions as well can affect in a negative way, the harmony of the population.
Thank you much. Eric, do you want to help us here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, I think they are different, and this is again, you begin to see, if you look at even back in the 1500, the way European powers were fighting among themselves on the African continent. What was it for? For gold, for the mineral resources, for all of those things. And that hasn't really changed that much. Of course, there are new twists to that. And so you're thinking about the different, like the Portuguese, the French, the Britons, and that's where you see how different African countries are speaking different languages. Frankly, they're not different, but the languages are determined by the colonial masters and how that operate. And so then that has also weaved into the leadership process, because the way it has worked, let me go back even with the transatlantic slave trade, because those who were picked to be part of the traders, they've used them to sometimes got their children to go to Oxford, to go to most European universities to study. And so then they will come and continue on their father's legacy, their parents' legacy. And that's the same way that we're seeing. And so you're beginning to see that the history has been evolving. And so for me, most of the work that I do, I look at it, I think, from the template by which, the race-based enslavement mechanisms work. And it has also fashioned in the way that the leaders, African leaders today, who are mostly coming out of the generations who profited off of it, continue to benefit. And so now today we have, like, even frankly, the idea about, African leadership, we have the colonial bourgeois, which the idea that those who were even fighting for independence, a lot of them, with the exception of few people who had really good motive, majority of them, the idea was that given that they have become masters of, they have become so crafty in mastering the act of being European, they wanted European bodies out so that they can now take over and begin to actualize the European culture, the European lifestyles, and all of the things that by virtue of the European education they have learned. And that's what is happening, because that kind of thing always see humanity within a hierarchical terms, right? And so when people are seen within that hierarchy, they are not seen on the basis of their humanity. And so where you belong to in a hierarchy, as we see here with race and things, it is tied to material, economic, and in social prestige. And that work to discriminate. It worked to ensure that the resources within the given context that the members are supposed to benefit from are unevenly distributed. And that leads to this opportunity hoarding. The problem we have in Africa is not that we don't have anything. We have the problem of opportunity hoarding, that the opportunities and the resources are concentrated in the hands of few people at the expense of the masses, and it's creating a lot of issues. And that's one of the ways that the leadership is being deployed to do some of these things through the same Western powers. And then to back to what I think, we have been just hearing, you begin to also see the idea of race making is still interweaved into our state formation process. And I like the way, Zachariah was talking about this. So you have on one hand, you see how even here, look at the way the race-making idea has created a global polity, making all persons of European descent to be in solidarity as constructed as white. And then all those who are not white, are also be like, we are different and we are on this hierarchy. But then how that has been weaved into the national identity thing, making all of us feel like, once we take on the nationality thing, it makes us to feel like we are powerful. Because then if we mention I am an American, you are speaking about power. That means that anywhere I go, I look at this other person, I am superior to them. And so we deploy that and engage in some of those things that even generate some other concerns. I think from a leadership standpoint, people want to, emulate some of these practices and cultures, and it make the hierarchy to be sustained. And we weave that into our internal mechanisms, policies, leadership. And so when you have people in leadership is supposed to be servant. But today leaders have become, like God in themselves, over people that they are supposed to serve. Okay. It is that logic.
Thank you. Dr. Mampili, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would, try to build off of what I just offered is, I think there's a global crisis of leadership. I don't think it is unique to the African continent. I think I see it across the global north, in the United States. I see it in South Asia, where my family is from. We live in these sort of gerontocracies. It's not unusual to have leaders who are in their late 70s, early 80s, governing over populations that are far, far younger. The average age of an African is 16. The age gap between African population and the African leaders is 40 years, right? Which is the same age gap between Americans and President Biden, who was the oldest president in American history, right? That's the average on the African continent. So there's a real disconnect, and I think it manifests in many different ways, right? I think they're trapped in certain kind of ideas, some of the ideas that I was expressing earlier, that have not worked, that are not effective, that tend to view young people in particular as a threat rather than an opportunity to harness, right? We see this in numerous ways, especially around the question of migration. African leaders have allowed their countries to be transformed into these buffer zones to prevent their own young people from traveling to Europe, often again through tremendous violence, right? Countries like Rwanda have offered to take on refugees and asylum seekers from England and have them exported to Central Africa. What a horrific, brutal thing, right? Take people from a third country, from Latin America, trying to get asylum in the UK, and you send them to Rwanda with the participation of the Rwandan government. I mean, that is grotesque, right? It's inhumane.
Yeah.
And I think, again, it reveals the disconnect between the population, which is young, which is energetic, and the contempt with which they're held by these leaders. The problem that they have to be controlled, they have to be regulated, right? And I think it'd be unfair to blame just the age of the leaders, because we see, again, these ideas in the global north as well, right? If you look at the Republican vice presidential candidate right now and his obsession with trying to force women to have babies, right? This is not unique, right? It is, again, a very problematic resolution to a real problem, right? In their mind, they don't want these migrants coming in, but like I just mentioned, the population would collapse without them. So what is your solution? Well, you have to force the women to have the babies, right? In Africa, we see across many African countries, even in countries that historically have been very liberal, like Cote d'Ivoire, an obsession with young people's sexual practices, right? So the criminalization of gay sex, people being lynched with the encouragement of political elites for their very private personal sexual behaviors in ways that we didn't see even 5, 10 years ago, right? So around the world, we are starting to see governments, because they are so bereft of any ideas of how to deal with the real crisis that we are facing, choosing these strategies to intervene into our most personal domains, right? A woman's right to choose, a human's right to fall in love with who they want to love. Increasingly, that's all they have left, right? And sadly, it's not like the global north has been this liberal beacon pushing for some sort of universal values, right? Instead, governments across the EU, governments across North America have been trying to use governments in Africa, who are often led by very venal and corrupt leaders who are susceptible to these types of overtures, to implement, I think, these extremely retrograde and backward visions for our futures, right? And what do young people do? Well, as we talked about last time when I was here, they protest, they rise up in the streets only to be crushed by their own governments, or they flee, seeking some sort of better opportunity, right? And that's really tragic that that's how we deal with our youth, rather than actually trying to address their very, very legitimate concerns, right? And I think it is a crisis of global leadership, and I think it's being reflected in the collapse of what we'd call the Western liberal order, right? That we are all living through, and we are certainly unclear about what will happen next.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the total, we have 30 minutes left, so how many more? Okay.
Q&A.
Okay. Also okay, so it's wonderful because when we look at the African society and look at the migration trend, in Africa, I coming from a French-speaking country, and the keynote speaker saying that, talking about real independences in Africa, and other people talking about, independence really doesn't exist in the French-speaking African countries. But when we look at how they got the independence from France, and the French presence in those countries, so then anybody in those countries will leave the country. To go, find himself or herself somewhere else. Because you cannot live in a country when you cannot really build factories. You cannot live in a country where you don't control your educational system. You cannot live in a country where you don't really control your economy. You cannot live in a country where you cannot control your own army. You cannot live in a country where you don't even control your own currency. So there's so many things.
Questions from the
Yeah, okay, yeah. I'm just adding this so quickly that I'm going to get a question. Okay, living in a society like this, it'll be difficult. So people in this country will tend to leave the country. Okay, so just a little, addition to whatever they said. Okay, then, now it's open to questions. Go ahead, sir.
Hello, Ryan McDonald, Master's of International Studies here at HLS. A lot of these political phenomena in the global north are not happening along entirely unexplainable lines. Men and women are having extremely different preferences in their choices of policy and method. And so in what angle does the global south replicate these patterns of sex-based differences in policies? And what influence does this sort of political polarization between men and women stand to shape future policy?
Interesting. Anybody want to jump in?
Okay, I go back to, one of the things that, particularly in the most African indigenous setting, the role that the women play is very critical. Like in Ghana, for instance, we call the woman equated to Asasia. It's like the land. It's a symbol of a nurturer, a protector, a giver, and in even the traditional sense, the way the chieftaincy, the chief, the female had a tremendous power over the chief decisions and other things. But today, none of these things exist. Again, this is where sometimes we are quick in dealing with the symptoms. We don't really focus a lot about the patterns that have ruled some of these things. The oppression of women really is white supremacist logic. I mean, white women were not even, we know in this society, white women, how they were meant to be at home and keep order, ordering the children and be submissive to husbands, right? But when these ideas begin to take on this global nature, it began to kind of work to displace some of these indigenous knowledges that honor and respect the humanity of women, and now brought in this huge patriarchy system. And now it is taking on this phenomenon that looks like it is, a current issue. But if you look at the patterns, it's clear. And these are one of the ways where you begin to see that even all of us, we have become so implicated in the kinds of the ideas that we have embodied is violent in nature. And it is that idea, the more we, release them into anywhere action, we see the impact they produce. That's what makes us to know that we are caught up with this epistemology that is too much violent in its origin, right? And I think part of that is going to be, we need some sort of repair, healing. I mean, in the way we see ourselves and we relate to others, both gender-wise and across the things around even race, ethnicities, and how that is even weaving into national identity issues.
Okay, any other question? Anybody want to add something quickly? Because I know I have more questions out there. Okay, yeah.
Maybe we should take 2 or 3 questions.
Okay, now I will go back to.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jimmy from the media school. Like the keynote speaker noted, the biggest migration is taking place internally, especially in countries which are facing conflict.
In where?
Especially in countries which are facing conflict.
Oh, okay.
So in that context, and considering the problem of leadership in most of these countries which have conflict and where politics is a zero-sum game. So in terms of thinking ahead, what kind of solutions can be proffered to help deal with this internal migration where politics is a zero-sum game? Youths have no avenue within which to protest, because when they protest, they're killed, they're brutalized, so they have no way out. So how do you solve that problem? What kind of solutions would you prefer? Thank you.
Okay. Anybody want to propose a solution?
Should we take a few questions, or do you want to just?
I'll let them answer. Okay, can we take a few questions? Okay.
My name is Beth Samuelson, and I direct the African Studies program here in this building. I've given a lot of thought to the idea of free movement of human beings. So, Dr. Mampili, you talked about free movement of capital. Why is it that human beings can't move freely, right? And there are a lot of reasons for that and so forth. But what I really want to focus on is something that you were saying, Dr. Jerry, about healing. Because the kinds of migrations that we've been talking about often involve a great deal of trauma. And protests involve trauma and so forth. And so I guess what I want to throw out is something that I've been having conversations with here in the building with some thought partners about how do we help people to feel that where they are, their culture, their language is valuable, right? And that when they go out, because they can move freely, right? Like if they go out to work for a while, they're probably gonna wanna come home because they value it. They see how they can contribute to their own family, to their community, but they can work somewhere else for a while or go somewhere to study. And these institutional barriers that exist internationally, but also intranationally, there are a lot of institutional barriers, even in the United States, that prevent people from moving freely, even though we think of ourselves as a free people, all right? But how do we help people to have that sense of confidence and belonging and home, essentially, that gives them the grounding, right? So when you migrate or when you travel, you're doing it because there are opportunities, right? Maybe you're discontented with where you are. I was like that. I went to Taiwan for 4 years. I had to like get away from home, okay? And the reason I came back was because of a love of home. And eventually, so that freedom should be available to everybody. And some people will stay wherever they want to be, but why is it that we can't have a greater freedom of movement for human beings and see them as human beings, not as cogs in a capitalist system?
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, we take another question, a third question. So there and there. Okay, Nana, I think you were like a second person.
Hi, I'm Elliot. I'm an HLS student. I wanted to ask, at what point and what were the causes of the switch from people, immigrants specifically, being viewed as a resource and an asset to the development of a country to being viewed as a problem? And how do we kind of change our mindsets regarding that?
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we can go ahead and answer. So anybody?
I can try. Just to offer some thoughts to start us off. I mean, I think the last question is a good place to start, and it's important to recognize that it's probably not a chronological story. If you look at American history, you can find hatred against immigrants that goes back throughout American history. It wasn't always black and brown immigrants either. The Irish, Italians in New York City, where I live, were a despised community who were compared to dogs. So that there always were forces in American history that were against immigrants, and there always have been forces in American history that are pro-immigrants, just like today, just like it was 100 years ago, and probably before then as well. Right. So the question to me, and this I think will come to the question asked about, zero-sum games and what we do about it, is to be able to identify the forces correctly. That's why I wanted to start my comments off by situating them in a much larger context, right? I think it is very hard for us as a species to kind of grasp the scale of the problems that we confront, the challenges that we confront. And so then one of the solutions for people in the United States, as well as for African leaders, is to try to distract us by emphasizing these sorts of cultural issues, right? So instead of, in my opinion, talking about climate change, right? Talking about industrial policy, you want to talk about young men being left behind, genuinely have problems finding work in economies that have left them behind. We talk about the issue of transgender rights, right? Which is not to say it's not an important issue, but certainly doesn't rise to the level of some of the challenges that we are confronting as a nation and as a species, right? It's just much easier to invent stories about immigrants eating dogs and cats in Ohio than it is to sort of confront the failures of American economic policy and the fact that the U.S. economy has become much, much more unequal, right? We're told, my family's immigrants, obviously, that this was a land of opportunity. We have less social mobility in the United States today than Europe, which is the old country, which is the country that's the part of the world that social categories are supposed to be frozen. It is harder to shift your economic status in the United States than it is in Western Europe. Right? This is not unique to the United States. Across the world, since the end of the Cold War, we have seen a massive spike in inequality in every region of the world, including in Africa. Right? Africa in the 80s and 90s, much like South Asia in the 80s and 90s, was much poorer, right? But it was also much more equal. And I'm not saying it's better or worse, right? But you can see it if you walked around places like Tanzania or even if in India, people were poor, but there was equality. I'm not saying that's better or worse. You can come up to your own determination. What we do know is that inequality has spiked. It has become insane. Right? And that is true in the United States as well. We have a smaller and smaller number of people who are benefiting from the economic system that exists. You can see this. Look at who's driving the election. One set of billionaires on this side, another set of billionaires on that side. It's not unique to the United States. It's the same thing that we see in Europe. It's the same thing we see across African countries, right? Nigeria now has multiple billionaires. And they act like that's something to be proud of, right? Rather than a failure. Nigeria both has the most billionaires in Africa and the most number of people living in extreme poverty in the world, right? 85 million Nigerians live in extreme poverty. So who cares if they have 5 billionaires? I find that strange, right? I'm not romanticizing the 1980s, but you hear the same story in India. You have these people, some of them are the richest people in the world. There are Indian families, 2 families in particular, that are worth over $100 billion, right? You've never heard of them because they don't do anything productive, right? They only have that kind of money because of their proximity to the ruling party, which walks around and pretends like it is a pro-po party. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. These are the challenges that we're confronting, a world in which fewer and fewer people are taking up more and more resources, right, while leaving the vast majority of us with nothing. And then we fight over cultural issues. It's a brilliant strategy, right? And it's tragically unfolding in so many parts of the world in ways that I think prevent us from having honest conversations. Whatever country we want to talk about, and I'll stop here because I want to let my other panelists speak, I could give you examples, right? In the Congo, in the Sudan, there are people making money on a world scale, right? And they do it by extracting resources at a level that is inconceivable for the human brain. If you go to Eastern Congo, where I've been many times, right, and you see some of these mines that are the source of the resources that are driving the green transition here in the United States. They are extraordinary vast. They're bigger than this campus, right? And they're filled with more young people, right? Preteens, extracting those resources for the profit of foreign billionaires in conjunction with Congolese elites. That's what they're fighting over. They're not fighting over ethnicity. They're not fighting over whatever you think they're fighting over. They're fighting over billions and billions of dollars. And the entire global capitalist supply chain is complicit, is essential to these kinds of fights. Right? And so for me, we have to be able to make these connections, as difficult as it is. Right?
Anybody can add something to that because we don't have any more.
One sentence.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the way to, recognize immigrants would be providing path to citizenship. That would be the best recognition. So, because immigrants play important roles wherever they go. That's all I can say. This direct path to citizenship.
I mean, just to add up to what I forgot your name, what you asked, and then what Bert was saying. The idea about seeing, people as resource. I mean, I think that's something that's across the board. It's a normal thing. It's a positive thing since time immemorial because we all connect each other and we are resources to each other and to our communities, our environment. Because, through people, things operate even at the structural level, but human beings are the mechanism by which things connect, have their materiality in the direct effect that they have on others. I think the question is, and that will come to some of the questions that Bert was talking about. The question is how we have, few people have sort of deployed this idea in a more, kinds of, from that violence idea to exploit that idea that we are resource to each other, but few people have sought to exploit that to their advantage over all of us and in a more reciprocal way, right? Because I think none of us, we all depend on each other. But look at even the way capitalism has overturned that idea of our interconnectedness and our interdependentness. And then It's using it, but here we all, even in this country, we say we are individualistic society. How is a capitalist society an independent or individualistic society? No capitalists make their gain by themselves. It's a highly codependent society. But we said we are independent. You see how it has worked to overturn that aspect where we can connect with each other. And so now, we are colonialized to think that we are independent. So we see things just by ourselves. But it has used to create this global proletariat that they're dependent on all of us. And so few people are utilizing the benefit that exists within each of us as resource to each other, and then making us to turn away from that, what is normal. And so you see, we have normalized what is insanity, and we are living by it, right? And it's creating so much harm, it's creating hurt, and it's fracturing our society. And so for us to, that's where, for me, I think healing, and that will have to work from our epistemic standpoint, seeing reality and calling it what it is, and then looking at ways to recapture that sense of our interconnectedness in a more positive way that does not benefit few people, but it's something that we share. And we begin by building trust, building relationship, building communities, because that way we will be able to see how all of us, how we are made to feel like we are different. These days we don't talk about what we all share together. We are always thinking about our differences. Of course, we are unique in different ways, but our uniqueness is actually what should make us feel connected to each other, because it brings, a different dimension that bring our wholeness together. But we are capitalizing on these social invention, and we are actually calling ourselves so different, and that difference is creating huge empathy gap, right? And when that empathy gap is widened, the more we remain passive and complicit to all these forms of violence that are happening. But at the end of the day, who benefit? Few people, and all of us get hurt by it. And so if we can begin to see and retrace our step back to what makes us as human, we will be able to work towards that repair and, changing the narrative by which we have been given, and creating a narrative that we all, connect with, and that also aligns with our reality.
Okay, I think that will close our discussion here, and thank you guys.
Thanks so much to our panel for those really diverse and useful insights. I want to invite everybody to step outside into the atrium. We have a reception. And remember that tomorrow morning, starting at 8:30, right outside these doors, there will be sort of a light breakfast snack served. And at 9:30 tomorrow morning, we start off with our second of 4 panels. So we hope all of you will be able to join us tomorrow. Let's thank Tariq Riebel again and our panel for a great start to this symposium.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, sir.
My brain was fried.